Howdy, hackers. Welcome to this workshop, which is an intro to cloud computing. Before we start, I'd like to say congratulations on getting through the first day. I've been reading some of the discussions that are happening on the app, and it sounds like there are a lot of interesting ideas this year, so congratulations on that. My name is Comfort Alora, and I'm currently a master's student at UTSA. I have a software engineering focus in computer science, but I also do research in computer information and security. Today, for this workshop topic, we are going to be talking about intro to cloud computing. So this would be really good for people who have no experience in cloud computing and want to get to learn a little bit more, or for people who are looking to switch careers into cloud computing. All right, let's get started. So our agenda for today is first, we're going to talk about what cloud computing is and what the cloud is, why you should choose cloud computing, the types of services that are offered and the types of deployment models, the uses of cloud computing, and then we're going to do, kind of like an extra to this because it's going to be like a concise deep dive into cloud computing with Azure, and then just understanding the Azure fundamentals with some use case scenarios. And then finally, you'll have some resources to actually get hands-on and get your hands dirty with cloud computing and specifically Azure. So what is cloud and cloud computing? So the cloud refers to an online collection of data centers that are used for managing, organizing, and assigning resources to provide solutions that meet business goals. And so basically, it just provides remote capabilities to abstract the underlying services that a business needs to thrive. So you have someone else who's pretty much provisioning all of the heavy lifting capital expenses that you need, and then you can just focus on the business process, right? So cloud computing basically is the practice of using and utilizing a network of remote servers to meet the needs of a business, right? So giving on-demand computer system resources and business services that are hosted on the internet to store, manage, and process data, rather than having a local server or a personal computer where you have to do all the work. So something that's really interesting, and I think the biggest seller of cloud computing is the fact that it's a global resource and you can have your resources or your services hosted on the internet and then accessed anywhere in the world. So why choose cloud computing? So we'll just talk about what there was before cloud computing. And so it was first using dedicated servers as a business, to moving to using virtual private servers and then using shared hosting. Here you can see like a very good visual of what all of that looks like. So first of all, we'll start with the dedicated hosting. Dedicated hosting was basically when there was just one physical machine that was dedicated to a single business, and that was very expensive but highly customizable. And then the move to the virtual private servers is where there was one physical machine that was still dedicated to a single business, but the dedicated machine is virtualized into many different machines, sub-machines there. So it gave more flexibility to run multiple services. And then moving to shared hosting, we have it where there is one hosted physical machine as well, but this time it's shared by many different businesses. So if you think about it like that, if you're sharing resources, it would make sense that it would be cheaper. But now you had the constraint of having a limit on the amount of services you could run on it because it depended on peak times. So if there was a lot of traffic to the servers, then the other businesses sharing those servers would have latency issues and some other issues as well. And then now we're at cloud hosting, and what cloud hosting does is it has multiple physical machines that act together as one, hosted on the cloud, and it can be dedicated to one business or it can also be shared by different businesses. But cloud hosting is really bringing a fusion of all of those together to give you the best of both worlds, or all worlds, and you have cost-effective, flexible, scalable, highly customizable services that are being run for you. So this is kind of like a brief history on where we've been and now where we are with cloud computing. And we'll just talk about some advantages of cloud computing. So in the past, we had to spend a lot of money to buy servers for hosting websites, like we talked about the virtual private servers and the dedicated servers. And you had to deal with inconsistent use in the case of the shared servers and go through a lot of tedious troubleshooting to fix issues if you're keeping on-prem equipment and networks and you're having to maintain that by yourself. So now in the era of even bigger data that we have from all of the types of services that we're using right now, if you think about, for example, maybe something like a Netflix, maybe something like an Airbnb, where there's a lot of data to be gone through. With cloud, using cloud for something like that, we enjoy increased storage capabilities, lower operating costs, scalability, decreased self-dependent infrastructure, easy access to a lot of competitive services that are just provided as software as a service through the cloud, and increased security and so much more. So this is why there's a big push for cloud computing, and this is why a lot of companies who are using more traditional methods are moving to the cloud. So this is a very hot field right now for a lot of computer scientists. And then we can move on to the types of cloud computing services and the deployment models. So there is something called infrastructure as a service. We have platform as a service, and we have software as a service. So with infrastructure as a service, we have just the basic building block of what cloud IT is. And so it's the closest idea to the management of physical servers, which are more traditional, and the target audience for people who use infrastructure as a service is administrators. And so examples of that is Azure, AWS, virtual machines, and more. And for a platform as a service, we have the notion that, there is the layer that concerns the management of the physical servers and the interconnectedness, but now it just gives maybe the developers, mostly are the target audience, it gives the developers the ability to just focus on their development and the deployment of that. So there it manages the whole hosting environment. So that means the provider handles the virtual machines as well as the networking resources and the operating system and more. And for examples of that, we have Azure virtual machines, AWS as well, cloud, pretty much all of the cloud services. And then with software as a service, this is where a product is run and managed by a service provider, and all the user really has to do is just provide the data that's needed to use the service. And so the target audience for software as a service is customers. And so you can think about it like all the products you have in your Office 365 suite, Salesforce, and more. And so right here, we have a diagram that kind of gives more insight to what infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service is, and the different layers that are handled by either the provider, which is what you'd call the cloud provider, or the tenant, which is the client. So you can see like on-prem is what was traditionally done in the past. So, everything was on premises of the business. And so the client, pretty much the tenant, did everything. And then now you can see with infrastructure as a service, the client only manages this portion while the provider manages this portion. So you can see it's kind of like a building block, right? So on-prem handles everything, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service and software as a service has different abstractions of what the cloud provider manages and then what the client themselves manage. Okay, so the different cloud deployment models that are available right now are public cloud, the private cloud, and the hybrid cloud. When you talk about the cloud deployment model, you're basically just talking about a defined structure of the infrastructure for deployment, where that lies, who manages what, and who maintains and controls what. So a cloud deployment model is a specific configuration of environment parameters, such as like accessibility and proprietorship of a development structure, of a deployment infrastructure, excuse me. And so with public cloud, the services are available to any purchaser, and the server infrastructure is owned, managed, and distributed by the cloud provider. With the private cloud, the computing resources are used exclusively by users from a single business organization, where the infrastructure can be physically located at the organization on site in their data center, or can be hosted by a third-party cloud provider. So it can be on-prem or, hosted by a cloud provider in the cloud provider's data center. And then hybrid, as the name suggests, brings these two together. And so, I won't go really into the pros and cons, but they do have their pros and cons for the different deployment models. Now we'll just do some very quick questions. I know this is a recorded material, so I don't know how fast you guys are going to be able to answer, but just go through it in your head. There are going to be a lot of question opportunities to answer questions, so just try to. So with this, in your opinion, given what we've talked about the deployment models, which is the most cost effective? And in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, if you guessed public, then yes, you're right, because they're the certain, it's almost like a shared hosting environment still, so it should be cheaper, right? And so which is the most configurable out of these? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's probably not 5 seconds, but private. If you have a private cloud model where it's being dedicated to a single business organization, then it would make sense that it's highly customizable, right? And then finally, which of these require the least technical knowledge? The answer, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, would be public, because obviously the cloud provider manages everything. So you don't really have to have any technical expertise as the business owner or as people within the business unit using those services to be able to put it together. And so these are the 3 main cloud deployment models, but there are some extensions which you can find some information about, like the community cloud model and the multi-cloud or cross-cloud model. So in the community cloud model, it resembles the private model. The only difference is the set of users, right? So in private cloud, only one company would be owning the private cloud server, but in community deployment, there can be several organizations, but all sharing similar backgrounds that share the infrastructure and the related resources. And then for cross-cloud or multi-cloud, it pretty much is used for bringing different cloud providers together. So they're different cloud providers, and we'll talk about that, but like an AWS maybe provided service and a Microsoft Azure provided service, bringing those together and helping them communicate and work together for the business function is what you can do with multi-cloud deployment models. And so it uses certain tools to be able to make that communication possible. And one of those tools that you can use is called Azure Arc. So that is pretty interesting. And then now we can move on to the various uses of cloud computing. What can cloud computing be used for? So there are a lot of things, right? You can use it to create cloud native applications, which are optimized for cloud, the scale of what the cloud covers and the performance of the cloud. You can use it to analyze data that uses a lot of data that needs to provide insights or to make machine learning decisions and things like that. You can use it to store, back up, and recover data. You can use it to embed intelligence within things. So, thinking of AI as well there. You can use it to develop software as a service and deliver software as a service. You can use it to stream audio and video. So, Netflix is using cloud resources. You can also use it to store, back up, and recover data. Why do I have 2 of these here? Okay, so yeah, you can use it to store, backup, and recover data. Apparently that's really important, right? So let's go into a deep dive into cloud computing using the service provider Azure. So first of all, there are different cloud service providers, like I talked about previously. There's AWS, there's Microsoft Azure, there's Google Cloud Platform, there's the IBM Cloud, and more. Why am I focusing on Microsoft Azure today? It's because I have an interest in learning about the Azure cloud services that are available, and Microsoft is also, I think the two biggest cloud providers that there are AWS and Microsoft Azure. AWS is bigger than Microsoft Azure, but you also need to consider the fact that AWS or Amazon got into the cloud space before Microsoft, right? So now Microsoft is kind of playing catch up, but even then, I think I mentioned it later on, you'll see that Microsoft Azure has the highest number of regions, and we'll talk about what regions are very quickly as well as we go on. So we'll be focusing on Azure, and what we're going to talk about here is a concise version of the course that Microsoft provides, which is a course on Azure Fundamentals. There's a certification for that. And it's a lot of information. There's no way we're going to go through all of that information in 45 minutes or less. So I'm just going to pick the most important parts. And I think like parts that I feel like are easily spread across other cloud service providers, and things that you can, once you have that knowledge, you can kind of have a little bit of understanding of that knowledge from the other cloud service providers. So let's begin. What is Microsoft Azure, right? Azure is a pay-as-you-go cloud platform that's provided by Microsoft, and it provides services and functionality for building, testing, deploying, and managing applications through Microsoft managed data centers. Let's just say managed. So how does it work? It uses virtualization. Now, what is virtualization? We'll kind of talk about it in the view of virtualization, a hypervisor, a fabric controller. So there are a few things to remember. You might not remember everything. Don't worry about it. It is all right. Virtualization basically separates the tight coupling between a computer's hardware and operating system using an abstraction layer called a hypervisor. So the hypervisor is the software that enables virtual machines to run. Now, Microsoft data centers, if you think of a data center, it'll contain like a lot of racks of servers with hypervisors that are all connected by network switches to know which server services what. And using something called a fabric controller, the hypervisors can use a fabric controller that functions as the kernel of the Azure operating system to monitor, manage servers, and coordinate the resources, that are available within Azure for software applications through another overarching software called the orchestrator, which, as the name suggests, orchestrates the different services that need to be run. So just high level, I guess, just remember that Microsoft Azure uses virtualization to be able to run this whole thing, right? That is the cloud service Azure. So we're going to go through some Azure product interaction. So how is it that you're able to interact with the Azure services and use the services or use the resources that are available within Azure? You have 4 options to do that. There's an Azure Portal, there's an Azure client or PowerShell, there's the mobile application, and there is the Azure Resource Manager template. So with the portal, it's more like user-friendly, I would say. If you're not a developer and you've never used anything like the terminal, it's a web-based user interface. So it provides a GUI for you to be able to click and just, enter things to be able to make the services that you need or to be able to utilize the services that you need. The client and the PowerShell, they're essentially the same. They allow the execution of something called commandlets that call Azure REST APIs to perform instructions. So commandlets can be used independently or can be combined with scripts to orchestrate, that word again, autonomous processes. And the major distinction is, what your background is in. If you're more used to using a Windows OS and things like the Windows PowerShell or command line, you would probably want to use Azure PowerShell. If you're more used to the Linux operating system, you would probably want to use the CLI. And with the mobile app, it pretty much has all the services that Azure has. And you can run CLI and PowerShell command that's actually from the mobile app, but it's just a more instantaneous, I guess, avenue to reach the Azure services and applications that are available. So you can use it to quickly monitor and triage issues, and you can use it to kind of just do very quick fixes on the go if you don't have the availability of a laptop or a PC right there with you. And then the Azure Resource Manager templates, I guess, are the more technical of everything, because you can use this to create very detailed descriptions. You can think about it like having a configuration file, right? To provision resources that are supposed to be used within Azure and with Azure using a declarative JSON format. So the advantage here is that you can use this to create things that need to be run multiple times using the same logic, basically. So you prepare a template that can just be used for various orchestrations to create any required resources. So for instance, if you needed to create maybe 50 instances of the same resource, you would just write one template, and using the ARM templates, the 50 instances of the same resource can all be created at the same time. So ultimately, whoever it is, the developer or the DevOps professional or just IT professional, needs to only define the desired state and configuration of each resource in the ARM template just once, and then the template does all the rest for you. Okay, so we're going to go through use case scenarios for the Azure product interaction. Like I said, we're going to have like a few question and answers just to help convince you that you are learning something, hopefully. So first, let's say you're a developer who needs to set up your first virtual machine to host a process that runs nightly, right? So which of the tools that we've talked about is your best choice? I guess something to keep in mind, when you're answering questions like this is like, let's say this is your first virtual machine setup. So if it's your first virtual machine setup, if you have an answer, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, it would be the Azure Portal, right? Because we talked about it being kind of like a GUI. It's easier to understand, and it's a better resource for newcomers to learn about Azure and set up their first resources. Then what is the best infrastructure as code option for quickly and reliably setting up your entire cloud infrastructure declaratively? And we talked about something which is ARM. So it's the ARM templates would be the best to do that. And let's now go into talking about the Azure Portal itself. So we're going to focus on the Azure Portal. I'm not really going to show anything about the client or the PowerShell or the mobile application, because like we just talked about, for people who are newcomers and trying to learn more, the Azure Portal is where, you can gain the most from, at least in the beginning. Click on that. Okay, so when you click on that, you can see here, this is for Microsoft Azure. I'm signed in already, but if you were doing this and you wanted to sign up, I'm not going to go through the process for signing up because it's intuitive. You get asked a few questions and you do the sign up. You click for a free account, and this just explains some things about Azure, what you should know. And then you have a start free. Start free, you have to put in, usually you'll get a different view than I do here, right? So you get a different view that lets you put in your information. Usually you have to put in a credit card information, but you won't get charged unless you're using services that are not free. So don't worry about that. When you put all of that in, then you should be able to access your account. Okay, so this is what the Azure Portal looks like. I won't go into too much detail. It tells you what directory you're in. Right now, it's the default directory. I have a student account. that I signed up for, and I'll explain why I signed up for a student account. You can sign up for a student account within Azure. If it'll, give you the prompt to link your account to a student account. But here, we have different services that Azure provides. You can take a look at that. There's something about subscriptions, and pretty much you can manage subscriptions and manage which subscriptions are linked to which directories. So a directory and a subscription just gives information on what it is you're able to do with Azure. And you can take a look at it if you have different subscriptions. I have only one subscription with what I have, so I can't switch directories. But if you have, like if you're an actual business, right, and you have different subscriptions, which is very likely to happen for different departments, you can kind of switch between like maybe a subscription for the devs or a subscription for the testers or like DevOps team, things like that. And you can create a resource very easily. Like we said, it's a GUI. So you should just be able to click on things and make it happen just with clicks. So for instance, like if you're trying to create a web application, it's very easy. I'm not going to go through the process of creating it. This is just an informational discussion on cloud computing, but there are resources and tutorials to be able to do this. But, you can see here that my subscription is my Azure for Students, which is the only one that I have. And you can, pretty much create an application by giving the web an application name. You can either publish code or the Docker container. You can choose a runtime stack, whichever one you want to use. You can choose a region. We're going to talk about regions. I'm not in Australia, so you want to choose Central US and more, and go through the process of like doing everything else you need to do, having some information for deployment, having some information for application monitoring, and more. Here you have many options for a lot of different services that are available within Azure, but I think most of what you'll be using is just the all resources or your dashboard or your home. So all resources provides information that contains what resources you already have for Azure. If you make resources, they will live here, and you can get some more insights on those. If you go to all services here, this shows you the services that are available within Azure. And so there are a lot of different things. There's an Azure Cosmos DB for database. There's SQL databases. There's availability to provision virtual machines very easily. There's the Active Directory. There's so much. There's a security center, so much to be able to do. You can create pretty much anything from the services that are available, right? Okay, so we have access as well to something called the Azure Marketplace, which contains a lot of information or a lot of services, managed services from third service providers that you can use with your development if you need to have easier access to things that are already provisioned for you. So for instance, there are a lot of services here, but you can search in the marketplace, like creating a WordPress website. You can do that right here from Azure. You can create an application service that WordPress uses, and there's so many different things that are available within Azure. We don't have the time to like go through each individual one and try to understand it, but you can play around with it in your own time. And basically, there's a world of information, right? So with access to the portal, it includes free access to popular Azure products for 12 months and a credit to spend. I guess that's the caveat for 30 days, but it's a $200 USD credit, but you can only use it for 30 days. It also provides access to more than 25 products that are always free. The thing that I want to talk about, especially for a lot of people here, I'm guessing you guys are students, is that when you sign up, you can connect your account in the Azure portal to a school email. And with the school email, you get less credit, but you have it for up to a year. So I guess something smart to do would be to, if you're really trying to play around with Azure, is to use your free credit for the 30 days, try to maximize as much of that as you can, and then sign up for a school email, which gives you an extra 100 USD credit for up to a year. So there's some more information on Azure Portal and the free services that are offered right here. You can check that out in your free time. You will have access to this presentation. So we're going to go into Azure Fundamentals itself, right? So we'll just briefly talk about subscriptions, management, resources, and groups. I don't think we have a lot of time to spend there, but there are different resources that you can use within Azure, and I talked about that a little. Resources will live kind of under predefined resource groups that the business unit can create for themselves, and then the resource groups also have to live under subscription so that you can actually use those resources and utilize it for the business functions. And then the subscriptions will live under the overarching management groups. And that's where we talked about, like, you could have different subscriptions for different departments within a business. So there are necessary considerations that will vary per business. So Azure provides the functionality to be able to kind of abstract the different units of what Azure provides and providing information on, how to put those together and, provision which resources serve which departments, right? And then we can talk about Azure regions, and Azure regions are important. It's a big part of Azure. And basically the big picture of what to know with regions is that it's made up of different data centers that are located all around the world. And the data centers house physical equipment. So they really affect the availability, which is why Microsoft Azure having the most regions is so important, because it affects availability. So I guess the notion is that if one region is down, they can be able to get help from some data centers. Or if one data center is down, they can get help from other data centers within a region. So like a good example of this that talks about availability zones, which are groups that are close but physically separate, referring to the data centers within the Azure regions. And then this also kind of explains things about region pairs. So when we look here, you can see that each of these refer to an availability zone. And the availability zone, like we've talked about, contains different data centers that are, physically close, but they are different. And each of these availability zones that are present, containing different data centers within each of those availability zones, work together to make what is known as an Azure region. So an Azure region will have different availability zones that contain different data centers. And then you can have even further extensibility of that by linking regions together. So you have regional pairs as well that work together to give the whole architecture of what a region is. So the most important thing about region is that it provides redundancy, which is necessary to protect the information that all these businesses are relying on Microsoft to keep for them in case there is some sort of failure. Right now, a lot of people value availability. I know when you see, it's happened to me a few times, I'm talking about Netflix a lot today, but like with Netflix, sometimes you have where Netflix says, oh, we're sorry, so we can't, give you access to the shows right now because we're experiencing some issues. That's an example of a failure, right? If you have a very well connected a server network that uses this architecture, you have even less of those failures. And so Azure kind of promises to be able to give these services and increase availability, because that is so important. And apart from availability, the redundancy really also helps to keep, not just make sure that data is available, but also make sure that data is safely secured. So if there's a problem with one of the data centers, a data center that shares the same information as the data center that was down still has that information. So if you know, you don't have to worry about losing information because it's spread out across many different servicing centers that Microsoft owns. So like I said, they have more global regions than any other cloud provider. Right now, they say they have 52 geographic regions, while, you know, AWS right now just has 25 regions. And something else there is something called specialized regions. So for example, if, you know, organizations are dealing with critical information, they would be placed on specialized regions and not just like the US central region, right? And so it provides functionality for that to be able to use these buildings that create like isolation boundaries between the services it provides to everyone else and the services provided to these people. So if you can think like what kind of organizations can you think of that would need specialized regions? So governmental organizations and national data center regions are things that are available with Azure. So it's usually for a lot of the organizations that need things like security clearance because they're dealing with maybe national secrets and things like that. So that's a very good example of what you can have under specialized regions. So we'll talk about the Azure Marketplace, and I talked about that a little bit, so I'm not really going to go too much into it. It contains a lot of services and features right now. They provide more than 8,000 of those, and you can just think about it like the Azure App Store. So let's go through, I think the most interesting part is the overall tour of Azure services that are available. So there are different services that are available. I think like you can umbrella each of those under some major ones, and that's what we're going to go through. So for the core Azure services, we have the Azure Compute, and Azure Compute is usually the primary reason a company would make the move to Azure or to the cloud, you know, with compute services across different cloud providers. They cover microservices, virtual machines, and very important event-driven serverless computing services. And we'll talk about a little bit of what serverless means a little later. And they're useful for performing calculations, executing logic, and running applications. Next, we have the cloud storage services, which provides disks that are attached to the virtual machines. And they pretty much provide structure for storing files and data. We have the networking services, and these optimize the application performance and scalability by configuring and controlling the traffic in and out of Azure efficiently. And we have app hosting and web services, which allows running entire web applications on managed platforms already by Azure in either operating system, any operating system that you would like to host that on. And we kind of went through that a little earlier. There are the AI services, which includes machine learning and pre-built cognitive services that are used to search and analyze existing data to forecast trends and to improve the user experience of, you know, users. And then we have integration services, which are mainly logic applications and services that connect applications together to further the business processes through having their own workflows. And then we have IoT services, which allows creation of full featured dashboards that connect different IoT devices together, and it kind of gives like a hub to be able to control all of that and manage all of that as a software as a service solution. We have security services, which provide identity management. I think as devs, I think you don't need to be concerned with that. It's more administrative, but it provides identity management to provide tightly controlled access to management configurations, as well as with some security services, it can provide access to global security monitoring. So that means if, let's say, a data center is down or you're experiencing some issues with any of the services you have on Azure, there is monitoring within Azure happening that can give you like a big picture of this is why that's happening. This is what we're doing to fix it. This is like an estimated time for us to have it fixed and more. Then we have DevOps services, which can create build and release pipelines that are necessary for CI/CD, and which is continuous integration and continuous delivery. And it can help with deployment of applications and also helping to integrate third-party applications like Jenkins that helps with CI/CD more efficiently. And then finally, the big last umbrella is mobile services, and it provides back-end services for developers who are mobile developers. So for iOS, Android, and some Windows Phone applications, you can kind of use Azure Services or the mobile services to help with low-risk connectivity to on-prem data or to cloud data, and it provides data synchronization and auto-scaling for you. So we don't have the time to go through all of the services that are available within Azure, but we will talk about one that I think is very important. Like I said, a lot of the people that make the move to cloud are doing it for compute reasons. So we will talk about compute services a little bit more in detail. So there are different services within the compute service that Microsoft has. There's the Azure VMs, there is Azure Batch, and there's a little more we'll talk about later. But with the VMs, they provide infrastructure as a service. When you need total control over an operating system and the environment, you use Azure VMs. What they do, VMs, they virtualize the hardware, and you can use something called Azure machine scale sets to also auto scale the virtual machine. So virtual machines are software emulations of the physical computer. So with Azure Batch, what that does is it enables large-scale parallel and high-performance computing batch jobs. So it provides auto-scaling for you, which is very important because you might not always have high demand for the servers that you're utilizing. And something that's really important, I forgot to mention, there are different levels of demands in different seasons, right? So for example, for some websites, they might not have high demand on any of their services. There might not be high requests coming in during most of the year, except when you think about something like a Black Friday sale. Now all of a sudden they have high demand. In the past, you weren't really able to scale up or down the services you had working behind the scenes because you just had to have all the services and hope that when peak times come, it's sufficient enough, but it led to a lot of waste because a lot of the times you're not hitting those peak times. So with the cloud and like with Azure Batch, you're able to auto scale up or down so that when you have high peak times, it can provision more services. When you have low peak, requests coming in, you can scale down, and it does that automatically, which helps save on costs. And so that's something that's very important with cloud services across the board. And so the use cases for Azure VMs you can think about is for testing and for development. And then it's also useful for just a complete up and move to the cloud for businesses, which is why a lot of people use Azure Compute and use cloud computing. So another compute service we have is containers, and containers are kind of similar to VMs, but really instead of virtualizing the underlying computer itself, the hardware, like a virtual machine would do, containers sit on top of a physical operating system and instead virtualizes the operating system and not the hardware. So it's very useful for using loosely coupled microservice architectures that maybe don't need to share the same tech stack, but they're all being used by the same business. For example, when you use a container is if you had to make a website, but you want to split the front end services and the back end services for that, because sometimes you might need to scale up just the back end services for storage, but you might not want to make any changes to the front end. So having separate portions of the application, having them logically separated, you can maintain and scale up or down those individual containers independently. And so this is kind of like what containers versus VMs look like. So like with the VM, we talked about it virtualizes the hardware itself. So there's the hardware layer, there's the OS, but each virtual machine would have like its own OS where it has, all the other information that it needs. With the container, it virtualizes the OS. So every container is sharing the same operating system, but it puts different things into different containers, right? So you have a container here that bundles the application and the services for maybe some business application. And then for a different business application using a completely different tech stack, you have its own container that bundles its own applications and services. So that's why containers are so important. And this is like the visual difference of the distinction between containers and virtual machines. So we have Azure Compute Services again, serverless computing. Like I talked about, we will talk about serverless computing because it's very important. So serverless computing defines the execution environment that's set up and managed by the cloud provider that also provides automatic scaling to meet demand. So serverless computing does not require any infrastructure configuration or maintenance, and it actually really isn't even allowed. With serverless apps, they only run when they're triggered by an event that happens. So it's not really used for the user-facing systems. It's used in the back end, but the logic of that is very necessary to be able to provide better user experience. And something important with serverless applications is that it uses micro billing. So you only pay for when your code is called or being run. With serverless computing services, there are, I guess, further services that are available. So you have Azure Functions or you have Azure Logic. They're fundamentally the same thing. They can create complex orchestrations of what needs to happen within a system, but Azure Functions would be more code inclined and Azure Logic would be more GUI inclined. So like click and drag and things like that. So usually Azure Functions, maybe a dev might want to use something like an Azure function, but like a business analyst or something might want to use something like Azure Logic. So use case scenarios for Azure Compute. What if you need to process messages from a queue, parsing them by using some existing imperative logic that's written in Java, and you need to send those to a third-party API? What serverless option would you use? And the answer here is you need to kind of focus on the part where you have to use some existing imperative logic written in Java, meaning there is code. And so the best option would be to use Azure Functions. What if you are trying to figure out which Azure compute resource can be deployed to manage a set of identical virtual machines? You might not remember this one, but I talked about the virtual machine skill sets. That would be a service you can use to manage virtual machines. And finally, what if you want to orchestrate a workflow by using APIs from several well-known services? What is the best computing option for this scenario? So here, just focus on the fact that you're trying to use several APIs and you're just trying to control the logic, right? You would be using the serverless service Azure Logic. And now we're almost at the end. But very quickly, I want to kind of do like a bonus topic on the core Azure services. So just talking about AI and the Windows Virtual Desktop, because I think a lot of times when we talk about the cloud, it has to, when I think about the cloud, at least, my mind automatically goes to AI. So we'll talk about that and we'll talk about the Windows Virtual Desktop because it's really interesting. So with Azure AI services, there are different services that are under there. There's the machine learning service, there's the cognitive service, there is the bot service. With machine learning services, you can use that for making predictions when you want complete control over the design and the training of the algorithm, right? So you use your own data for that. And for cognitive services, there are already some pre-built machine learning models that Azure has within it. So you can use those on top of your own applications to do things like create AI that can help, you know, to see, hear, speak, and understand, languages, and even to begin to lead you towards the process of reasoning with your AI model. So this is used to solve general problems, such as analyzing text for emotional sentiment, or analyzing images to recognize objects or faces with, like I said, pre-trained models that exist. For the Azure bot service, pretty much it is like a chatbot. It's a chatbot service. So you can also like apply that on top of your existing applications. So creating a virtual agent that can kind of provide information to your users, like, they were human themselves, like the robot was a human itself. So yeah, the bot service behind the scene also kind of uses some information from cognitive services, for, I think mostly understanding, and for putting together sentences that would look like a real human did it. And then finally, we're going to talk about the Azure Windows Virtual Desktop. So all I want to say here is that this is very cool because it's really good right now for the era we're in with coronavirus happening right now and the increase of remote workers. You can use the Windows Virtual Desktop to be able to have a highly customizable and security enhancing solution to bring your remote workers together. So we'll go through some use case scenarios for Azure AI very quickly. Let's say you need to create a human computer interface that uses natural language to answer customer questions. Which product option should you select as a candidate? So ding, 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 if you're thinking about using natural language to answer customer questions, then the answer to that would be the Azure bot service. Okay, so let's say your company has a team of remote workers that need to use Windows-based software to develop applications, but your team members are using different operating systems all across the board. There's no uniformity. Which Azure compute service would help to resolve this scenario? So the compute service that's available is the Windows Virtual Desktop. If you guessed that, you guessed correctly. And finally, let's say you need to predict future behavior based on previous actions. Which product option should you select as a candidate for that? It would be Azure Machine Learning Services. So if you guessed that correctly, congratulations. And we are at the end of the workshop. I hope you were able to learn a lot about cloud computing and especially Azure. So what have we kind of gone through is that there are many options for cloud solutions today. So, what it comes down to is you need to kind of look through everything that each cloud provider offers as a service and kind of make your own decisions based on your need. So it's not always a one size fit all. You have to find the best business fulfilling solution for yourself. Cloud computing is undeniably powerful. It really is only getting more popular. And so, like I said, this workshop is very condensed, a very condensed intro into cloud computing, and I would say Azure as well. And really, there are a lot of available resources online now that you have the knowledge and you kind of know what is possible with cloud and with cloud computing. You can go explore those by yourselves. And there are a lot of resources to be able to do that. There are some tutorials that go through like very hands-on tutorial information to create things within Azure. And finally, something I just found out is that there is a Azure hackathon being hosted by Microsoft coming up, and I think the deadline to sign up for that is April 5th. So you can just go on Google and try to find that out. But I found the link for it. I didn't get a chance to add it to the presentation, but basically there's an Azure AI hackathon happening. So this should be fun to do. And like I said, yeah, the deadline is April 5th. So you might want to look into that. Apart from that, I hope you gained some helpful information, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your time hacking.